Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook for today, Tuesday, July 30th, 2024. Let's start off with the National Hurricane Center page, where there's quite a bit going on, not just in the Atlantic, there's also a lot going on in the Pacific too, but we do have the Atlantic, an area of interest, which we've been monitoring for the last several days, could be something to watch as it gets into the Western Atlantic, especially near the Bahamas region. And it does, according to the National Hurricane Center, they think it does have a pretty decent chance it could potentially become a tropical depression. They give it a 60% chance over the next 7 days. Obviously, they state that conditions are going to become a little more conducive in the Atlantic, with warmer waters in the southwestern Atlantic. And they do once again say a tropical depression could form in this general region. Lots of the models now really indicating this really trying to get going more towards the Bahamas, and potentially this might be something that we need to watch along the southeast coast um, towards the end of the week into early next week. We'll go over all the models though in just a little bit, but they're starting to come into a little bit more agreement on what this area of interest may do. Regardless, those in the Northern Islands, even in Florida, the Bahamas, and across the Southeast should all keep their tabs, especially if you're in the islands. You'll probably see impacts of gusty winds and heavy rains no matter what comes out of this. Even those in Puerto Rico and also the northern Lesser Antilles too, probably not going to see development by then, but the tropical wave part of this area will probably bring impacts to those areas either way. It's still going to be a tropical entity of some sort. It may not be a fully developed system, but it'll still bring impacts. That is something for sure to remember. In the Eastern Pacific, though, that's why I said that there's a lot going on, because look at the Eastern Pacific really beginning to wake up now from its slumber that it's been in since the start of the hurricane season there. We have three areas, all which have pretty decent chances of potential development. The main area we're watching right now is Invest 94E, and this has a 90% chance of development by the National Hurricane Center right off the southwestern coast of Mexico. There's also another area which has a high chance of formation over the next week just to the south of that, and potentially something a little bit further west going into the Central Pacific, another area too that could potentially develop as well. So the Eastern Pacific is really starting to light up. And as I said yesterday, wouldn't shock me over the next week or so if we get an additional 2 to 3 named storms in the Eastern Pacific. Certainly about time that they have a larger burst of activity. And we explained it yesterday that it was partially in result of this convectively coupled Kelvin wave. Sometimes my mind gets ahead of my words and I kind of get confused. Sorry about that. But we talked about this convectively coupled Kelvin wave that was moving through the Pacific. It's really helping set the groundwork for things to be more favorable for tropical development. And I also mentioned yesterday that we're seeing all of this activity happen right now in the Eastern Pacific, but this will slowly, over the next several weeks, begin to transfer into the Atlantic, and we'll go over why that may be the case in just a little bit today, just to or at least add on to that today more than we did yesterday, because I did also talk about that yesterday. But really quickly, here's 94E. This is actually pretty close to the southwestern coast of Mexico. It looks like they're getting outer rain bands, some thunderstorm activity associated with 94E, but one thing I should mention from all three of these areas is that they're going to stay well off the Mexican coastline. We're not looking at any sort of major impacts up and coming from anything that will develop in the Pacific, at least over the next week or two. And that'll be the case for 94E. And you can see right now, satellite-wise, it's starting to get its act together. You can see that there is some sort of circulation going on in there. Still has a little bit of more organization to do, but I wouldn't be shocked that this will be a tropical depression. I mean, the National Hurricane Center gives it a 90% chance of occurring. That'll probably happen over the next 2 to 3 days, once again, as it moves west-northwestward away from the Mexican coastline. And if you want confirmation of that, here's the model track guidance all the way out to the next 5 to 7 days. Basically, all of them are agreeing on a track well out to sea. And this could, at least according to some modeling that I've seen, this might become a pretty decent system as it's moving out, and as it's tracking away from Mexico. So the one impact that we could see, and this is pretty significant too, because this can be life threatening if you're not careful, but that is the swells and probably increased rip currents along the Mexican coastline. And once again, there have been fatalities from that, not just in the Pacific, but in the Atlantic in general. Sometimes people are not careful enough when they're on the beaches, but there's a big hurricane out to sea, and it causes all of these swells that end up making their way to the coast, and that causes a heightened rip current risks. I've heard many stories about people that have lost their lives. Not anybody that I know personally, but you could just see on the news every single time somebody loses their life to a rip current, heightened rip current. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And that's certainly something to be cautious of, even if we're not going to get any sort of actual real rain or wind impacts from the system, because it'll be moving out to sea. So definitely keep in mind about that if you're along the Mexican coastline. Otherwise, nothing much really in terms of needing to worry about in terms of direct threat in the Eastern Pacific over the next week or so. But just want to take a really quick, kind of widen our view so we could kind of get a shot of the Atlantic as well. And you could see a lot of the activity right now is really concentrated in the Eastern Pacific. We talked about this convectively coupled Kelvin wave kind of fertilizing things in the Pacific right now, while as opposed to the Atlantic, not yet there quite yet. But trust me, in about a few weeks, especially as we progress into August and we get closer towards the end of the month, things will start to get active in the Atlantic. Right? We obviously don't see that right now, but things will definitely start to get more active in the Atlantic. You can definitely trust me on that. For now, though, not much happening. We're mainly looking at this sort of low pressure system, kind of this front, I believe, that's off the East Coast. Looks like there's some showers and thunderstorm activity happening across Florida today. And I think there was lots of rain in the Gulf, as far as I'm aware. I have a guy that I talked to in Texas, and he told me, I think he's around, near the Houston area, and he's talked about how much they've gotten rain, quite a bit, over the last several weeks. And looks like today finally is a drier day for the northwestern Gulf Coast. So I guess that might be a little bit of a relief. But overall, elsewhere across the entire Atlantic, right here, I believe this is roughly the tropical wave that we're watching. And it's pretty barren right now. It's not really looking too, eye-popping. But once again, as we get towards the Western Atlantic, this is where we're really going to need to watch out for potential development. But there is still a little bit of convective activity. So if you're in the Northern Islands, just watch out. Maybe some occasional thunderstorms and gusty winds, typical things that you would see within a tropical wave. Those are still impacts too, even though they might not be full blown. Even though this is not a full blown tropical cyclone, this will still bring impacts, and that will still cause an inconvenience to at least somebody. But I do want to talk about, just really quickly, going into the future, when I did mention that even if the Atlantic is not so active right now, trust me, it will get active in a few weeks, because this is an interesting tweet that I found on Twitter, or X is officially called it, but I still call it Twitter. Vortex, I think this is a general weather account, tweeted that looks like the tropics aren't putting up with a fight with active basins all around, including the Atlantic, where it's more favorable. And they say, we have already enjoyed our break, but now the time will soon be over. And they mention this because of this global tropical hazard outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. And this is a kind of a long-range tropics hazards across the world. And you could see, especially as we head into the next 2 to 3 weeks into August, they have multiple areas of heightened risk for potential development in the Atlantic. And they even continue that into the Pacific as well, in both the Western and the Eastern Pacific. So we might not be over with our current sort of situation in the Eastern Pacific. Looks like we might have more on top of that. But this is what I've been talking about in terms of as we get into August, we need to start watching the tropics a lot more because things will definitely start to become more active. They have both into the middle, even into the latter portion of August. And you notice, especially towards the latter portion of August, things start shifting a little bit more towards the MDR and into the Western Atlantic too. Things are generally going to get more active. So definitely, if we don't have a lot of activity right now in the Atlantic, and it's also worth mentioning that the probability they have for development is actually a pretty solid one too. This solid red indicates, I think here, around a 40% chance or higher that they are expecting development. So you would assume that there is pretty high confidence that as we get into August and as we get through August towards the end of the month, things will start to get more active in the Atlantic. And if you think about it, climatology as well, it makes sense why we're seeing that. And so definitely, even though we don't have much in the Atlantic right now, it'll definitely start to get more active as we head into the month of August. And and I mean, kind of been expecting this given how active this season is potentially going to be. And we'll probably see that reflected and we'll probably see that realized over the next several weeks. All the signs are definitely pointing towards that. But at least over the next week, let's take a look at how the models show, specifically with our area of interest. And at least, though, over the next week, as we head into August, it looks like the Atlantic right now, at least for the first week or so of August, the biggest area we're really going to watch is that moderate chance that we have potentially in the Western Atlantic. The GFS, though, I will say, is not the most keen on this area, although it is really only the GFS that is not very bullish on this area. But you can see it's still reflected in the model. Right around days 6 to 7 shows it in the Gulf. And we go beyond that into the 7 to 10 day time frame. They try to develop this into the Gulf. I know that the previous model run had some sort of hurricane sort of situation going on, while this one kind of just shows a weakish system into the Gulf and nothing that is too consequential of any sort of imagination. But there's still something, and the GFS is still hinting that no matter what, we probably will see development of whatever tropical wave that we're monitoring in the Atlantic right now at some point. But once again, as I did mention, the GFS is not the most keen on this area. It's especially the European, or as we affectionately call the European model, King Euro, because the European model is really the most trusted model in terms of tracking and in terms of watching for development of these tropical systems. And the Euro has really been the most aggressive so far. They take this off the East Coast right around 5 days now, so just inside of 5 days. It shows this moving north of the Bahamas. The European generally keeps this off the East Coast, as do most models that now show what the European is showing. But very interestingly enough, they actually make this into a very formidable system. They kind of keep this off the East Coast, but things could be pretty favorable. And then as this moves northeastward and away from the East Coast and out into the Atlantic, well, probably, at least on the European, it looks like there might be some impacts to Canada, Atlantic Canada, that we need to watch. This becomes a hurricane riding the Gulf Stream, and that is the more aggressive solution that the European is showing. Although I don't think the European is alone in that anymore. Let's really quickly see what the Canadian has. And they generally show the same thing, although they show a little bit of a weaker system. And I guess because of that, they have this riding a little bit closer to the Carolinas coastline. And then they have it also taking it out to sea, riding the Gulf Stream, and then over the neck, and then beyond that, potential impacts to Atlantic Canada. So generally, along the East Coast, we take a look at most as a comparison from these models. Maybe not entirely yet that we should write off the East Coast just yet. I mean, this will be very nearby. Not sure about not sure about a direct hit on the East Coast right now, or at least if we take a look at the European once again. Actually, I'm going to look at the EC fast, because this is the one that actually has the 12Z run right now. Yeah, it keeps it off the East Coast. The CMC also shows development, and I think there's also another model, the Icon. Let's see what that does really quickly. if it'll load. Sometimes these models do not load very quickly. There we go. It also makes this a pretty formidable system, but it makes this a system heading out to sea away from the East Coast, and probably something for Atlantic Canada. So I'd suggest, if you're along the East Coast, definitely keep an eye on whatever is occurring in the Western Atlantic, especially if you're in the Bahamas too, because chances are you will be getting tropical impacts from this, whether it is a tropical system by the time it's in the Bahamas or not. But in general, we have an area of interest to watch in the Atlantic, and we'll see how this develops over the next several days. But generally, if you're in the southeast, and I'd say for those along the eastern coast of Florida, not many models really take it into the East Coast, so I'm not too concerned about it right now. But it is an area of interest to watch nonetheless. And once again, as we progress into August, we'll probably only start to see more of these areas begin to pop up in the Atlantic. But for now, things looking quiet, or we're only looking at one area right now, and we don't have many different areas that we need to watch out for. But that will change soon, and you can definitely trust me on that. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for today. Not much else to go over besides that. We obviously have activity in the Pacific too, which is beginning to increase, but that's looking like it'll all stay out to sea, and nothing is really threatening Mexico at this time, which is obviously good. Really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions as well, would definitely like it if you comment it in the comments below. I'll definitely try to respond if you have any questions. Other than that, have a great day, a blessed one as well. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again tomorrow.